Hey everybody, how are you doing? I hope your revision is going smoothly. It's time to revise. You can do it with me here today. We're going to look at the role of the father from AQA Psych Paper 1. And there's going to be some exam-style questions on the screen. You'll have a chance to pause, give it a go, come back when you're ready, and I'll talk through them. Let's do it. There they are, look. They look tasty. You got marks, you got timings. Here's your chance to pause the video, give it a go, come back. Let's do it. Okay, let's do it. Right, explain what research has shown about the role of the father. You don't need to know any key studies, there aren't any for the role of the father, but you do need to be aware broadly of what studies have shown. So, a couple of points you could make here for 3 marks. Let's go for research has found that fathers typically take on the role of the secondary attachment figure, and rather than getting involved in the day-to-day kind of, physiological care, like, feeding and changing and, bedtime routine, all that sort of thing, fathers tend to get involved with the more kind of physical elements of parenting and challenge and play, yeah? So fathers typically have been known to take on the role of the exciting playmate, is a phrase you might be aware of depending on which book you've studied from. What else could you include? You could mention how research has suggested that fathers may not be as sensitive to infant needs as mothers. So there is some evidence suggesting that they're less sensitive to their kind of physical and emotional cues. You could talk about, because this is all quite traditional at the moment, you could mention some other studies that we could use in a discussion later, but at this point, if it's just a 3-marker, you could also say things like, research has shown that nowadays fathers are starting to take on the role of, the primary caregiver more often. Yeah, so that's an open question. Any kind of studies that you're aware of on the role of the father would be fine there. Okay, but as I said, I'd just pick a couple for 3 marks and briefly outline their findings. Right, here we want to outline research into the role of the father. Now, this is different to the previous question because it's not so much about what they've shown, although that would be relevant. Here, it's also about kind of, I suppose, their procedure. Yeah, it's just outline research. So what has the research done and what's it found? So you could bring in the fact that, we've already talked about how they take on the secondary figure, but if you want an actual study to kind of talk about, you do know the Schaefer and Emerson one, I expect. Yeah. So one study into the role of parents was done by Schaefer and Emerson, and they found via, visits, observations, interviews, that mothers tended to be the one taking on the primary attachment role, and fathers tended to be the one that were attached to later on, towards the multiple phase at 10 or 12 months, and took on that secondary caregiver role. Yeah. Now, you don't want to go too much into, other elements of that study and talking about the mother too much, but there is focus there on the father. You could supplement that a little bit with, other studies. You could say that some research has compared mothers and fathers' responses to infants crying. Yeah, so there's research, and we'll mention this later on again, where they've kind of shown videotapes of infants crying to mothers and fathers, and they found that fathers might respond differently to that. Some research has actually shown that they don't respond differently at all, but any research into the role of the father is fine there. Again, it's just that here you need to kind of talk a little bit about how it was done, as well as how or what the findings were. Yeah, because it's just outline research. Okay. Explain the economic implications of research into the role of the father. So this has come up as a previous question. What you kind of need to think about here is how does, knowing about the role of the father, or how does studying the role of the father, or theories about the role of the father, how does that have an impact on, when it says the economy, things like working habits, who is in work, who is out of work, and that sort of thing, okay? So probably you're going to go down the route of saying that research into the role of the father, or research that suggests that fathers are secondary attachment figures, has the impact that fathers tend to be the one in work, or fathers are encouraged to be in work, but also it puts pressure on mothers to be out of work, yeah? Because if the research is all saying, fathers are secondary, mothers are primary. If you're, male and female parents, and you are, hearing things like that, then obviously that puts pressure on the mum to be the one at home and the dad to be the one going to work, okay, in that very kind of traditional stereotypical sense. So it perpetuates, and this is kind of where, you might go with that discussion, it perpetuates stereotypes. It maybe leads certain groups to be viewed negatively. Let's say you're a mother that actually has returned to work very quickly or is the main breadwinner. Maybe it's getting people in that position to be seen negatively. Yeah. So you might actually go on and say that this research is socially sensitive, and that's a term that you might be aware of from issues and debates and perhaps other areas of the course. Yeah. Maybe it's got negative implications for the economy. Yeah. Because, as we said, it's about people kind of being in or out of work. Yeah. Okay. Now we've got a STEM question. We've got Jason and Abdel. Abdel is taking them to soft play, his children. He says he likes it, he gets to run around, spend quality time with them because he's usually so busy with work. Okay, so straight away, hopefully what you're thinking, if you read something like this, is that Abdel is taking on that stereotypical kind of maybe breadwinner, secondary figure, yeah? So that's kind of what we're going to go on and talk about. Jason, on the other hand, good for you, mate. I've got to make dinner and sort their school clothes out whilst they go to a friend's house. Okay, now we don't really know much about Jason's home situation from that, but what is clear is that Jason isn't in this situation just taking on that secondary role. Just from what he said there, that's more of that, stereotypically primary role in terms of that physical kind of care and day-to-day stuff. Yeah. So both of these are fathers, and this leads us into talking about how some of that research maybe is inconsistent, or how some of that modern research has shown that fathers are starting to take on, or, for the last 20 or 30 years, have started to take on some of that primary role as well. Okay, so let's split this up a bit. The key points in the question are explain what research has shown, okay, and we'll refer back to Jason and Abdel. So, similar to what we've already talked about, yeah, studies have shown that fathers take on the secondary attachment role, involving, the more play and care, the exciting playmate was the phrase we used. Link that into Abdel and what he's saying, yeah. And then, it's not really a discussed question, but I think, however, makes sense in this context, probably even starting a new paragraph here. So, however, more modern research has suggested that fathers are taking on, indeed, very able to take on the primary attachment role. So, this ties in with what Jason is talking about, because Jason is taking on that primary role, the physical care, the day-to-day stuff, the dinner, the sorting the clothes out, all of that. Yeah. You could supplement that with some of those studies that, don't back up those traditional kind of stereotypical findings, such as there is one that compared, I mentioned it a few minutes ago, compared mothers and fathers' reactions to infants' distress and found no difference between how mothers and fathers kind of responded to that distress. So you could kind of lead that into what Jason is saying in terms of mothers and fathers arguably having a similar role. You could mention research that's shown that fathers can take on, those primary responsibilities, but often when that happens, they tend to share the primary attachment role, and there isn't really that secondary figure in terms of the father. They're kind of both, the mother and the father are both, the joint primary attachment figure. So there's loads and loads of stuff there that we've talked about, but refer to Jason, refer to Abdel. Abdel's taking on that secondary figure role, and Jason is taking on more of a primary or a shared role, okay? But the focus being on studies, and we have been through a few already. Okay, discuss research into the role of the father. So here's where we get a bit more into kind of the implications and the strengths and weaknesses of this sort of thing, okay? We did do a little bit of discussion just now in that application one, while I was chatting about it. But you're going to start off with just knowledge of the role of the father. And that could be studies, it could be just general theory in terms of taking on that secondary role or that economic role. Fine, we've already been over that. I'm not going to repeat all of that again. But for discussion, we're going to talk about maybe how there's research support, or there's, a lack of research support. Depends what you use and which route you go down. But you could say that, there's studies backing up that the father is more of a secondary figure. You could say that there are studies that show that that isn't necessarily the case. So you could do a paragraph kind of on how the research kind of shows one thing but also another, and maybe talk about, lack of reliability or whatever it might be. And you could do, because you probably want, for an 8 mark, you'd probably want 2 discussion points, right? So for another one, you could do something like the economic implications or the socially sensitive nature of this topic area, yeah, which we've been through already. But it would be, again, the negative impact on women because it's placing the burden of care on them and pressure on fathers to go to work and mothers to stay at home, that sort of thing. All right, so that's how I break down that one. Now, I have had a few people ask about, can we get a 16 marker on the role of the father? I've never seen one, never seen anything above, I think it's a 4 marker. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's impossible. It's AQA spec, they might decide to put that sort of thing in. Personally, I think that's pretty unlikely, but it would make sense to at least think about it. So let's do that. Just while I'm thinking about it, I'm sure I've seen, I think it might be Tutor to You, have kind of done a 16 marker on the role of the father and kind of a talk through. It might be like a model essay they've got either on their website or probably YouTube as well. So do check that out if you want to look at an example of what it might look like. But if I just share some thoughts on dealing with that now while we're talking about it. So we've already talked about doing it as an 8 marker. So what we're looking for here is just a little bit more knowledge in terms of, include some more studies. So that's fine. I think we've talked about loads. And then maybe another discussion paragraph. So we've already used, the points of how the research doesn't really agree, maybe talk about unreliability. We've already talked about the economic implications, so that's a good discussion paragraph. So another point or two that you could talk about, let's say, you could talk about biological determinism. You could talk about how, some people have argued that the difference is because of, women obviously have much higher estrogen levels than males do. So you could talk about how that kind of plays into the differences in the role of the father and the role of the mother. You could talk about, the lack of temporal validity in a lot of this theory and research. And that's where you could bring in some of the more modern studies showing that the father can indeed take on the primary role as well, yeah. And in that, you could kind of talk about, because you are, using terms like temporal validity, you're saying it's out of date, you could bring in the issues of kind of like societal attitudes, yeah. You could talk about how culture, how attitudes have moved on, and therefore we need to kind of reassess a lot of those earlier studies that are 30, 40, 50 years old by this point. Yeah. Okay. So there's a few thoughts, but yeah, we'll see. I think it is fairly unlikely that you get a 16 marker on the role of the father. But as I said, you could also check out what Tutor to You have done on that if you want an example. I haven't got time to do that now. Okay. So, don't forget, reflect. What happened? Why did that happen? And what are you going to do next? That's it for that one. Okay, I hope that was useful. As we said, role of the father is quite a small part of the spec. And I think when it came up a few years back, when it was, 2018, 2019, something like that, they had a couple of questions on it. I think that did actually throw people. But like I said, I've never seen any big questions on it, so we'll just have to see. This may come back to bite me. I just don't feel like it's particularly likely, given how much else is in attachment. But there you go. We'll see what happens. Anyway, I'm just waffling now. Good luck. Keep going. And I'll see you in another video. Bish bash bosh.